Welcome, everyone. I see folks are continuing to log in. As you log in, this is just a normal Zoom meeting. Please keep your microphone and video off during the presentations. We'll have an opportunity between the presenters for you to ask questions, and after the presentations, we've reserved 20 minutes for a live discussion. In the meantime, at any time, please send your questions through the chat box and our moderators will pass them on to the presenters. Thank you, everyone. This is Ben with Sustainable Northwest signing off and giving the microphone on the floor to our Forest Program Director, Kayla Swanson, to give a brief introduction to our presenters.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Kayla Swanson. I'm the Forest Program Director here at Sustainable Northwest, and have a great pleasure of getting to introduce our keynote speakers this morning for the first virtual Community Forest Forum, though not the first Community Forest Forum. Dr. Reem Hajjar will be our first presenter. She's an assistant professor at Oregon State University College of Forestry with research interests in community forestry and social science. She received a PhD in forestry from the University of British Columbia. Her recent publications include writings on community forestry, small and medium forest enterprises, and the perspectives of the Peruvian Amazon, Mexico, Brazil, and Canada. We're so excited to have you joining us to tell us about some of the global perspectives with community forests. And after Dr. Hajjar presents, we will have Dr. Susan Charnley, and I will introduce her after a short break between the two. We might want to have a couple questions depending on time. Thanks so much. And if you do have questions, please enter them in the chat box.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come and talk to this meeting. I'm only sorry that we're not going to be able to meet in person, but hopefully next year. Susan and I have been working on a project to create an inventory of community forests in the US. You may have heard from me already. You may have heard from Kaylee Kornhauser, who's a student working with us on this project. And that project is really broadly to better understand how community forests in the US function and how they contribute to rural development and governance innovation. So Susan's going to be presenting some of the preliminary results from that survey that many of you have probably received in the second half of this presentation. But what we wanted to do first was sort of step back a little bit and put our work here in the US in a more global context. As you probably know, community forestry has been growing substantially for decades now in other countries, much more quickly than it has been in the US. So I wanted to give a bit of an overview of some global perspectives on community forestry. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a bit about what community forestry looks like in other places, where we find it, why it's been spreading and increasing in the rate of spread in the last few decades, and then briefly on sort of how they're performing, sort of a global assessment of what we're achieving with community forestry globally. So let's start with how to define community forestry. Community forests happen in many different contexts. These three pictures are just showing, some very isolated Amazonian communities who manage their forests. And on the right here, these are community-owned factories in Mexico. So these happen in very different contexts. And I'm sure if you ask, 10 different community forestry scholars how to define community forest, you'll get 10 different answers. And I'm sure, in fact, if I asked all of you to define a community forest, we'd have a discussion for an hour and probably not agree on a definition. But I bet we could agree on a few common elements. So let's use that as a starting point. You could say community forestry is some form of community or local control and management of forest resources for local benefit. Okay, that's probably a common definition, a common element of a definition. But what if we wanted to get a bit more of a finer resolution on this definition? So the way that I look at it, and the way that is commonly looked at in the international literature, is to go beyond asking the question, who owns the forest land? I mean, it is a normal question to ask. If it's a community owns the forest land, then it's most likely a community forest because they have, decision-making rights over it and such. But plenty of community forests here in the US and globally, the communities don't own the land that forest is on. So you have to ask a few more questions. Who decides what happens on that forest area? Who has access use rights to the land? Who manages the area in terms of day-to-day operations and planning? Who's benefiting economically or otherwise? And who has the authority to lease or sell all these other rights? Who does all this stuff? The more often you answer community to all these questions, the more likely you can call it a community forest, right? Some people add a dimension of sustainability, that sustainable management is a requirement of community forests, but I think that kind of complicates outcomes with processes. So I sort of leave that out of the definition. So if you look at it this way, you have these, 6 different dimensions. The more often the answer is community, the more likely it's community forest, but that also leaves a lot of ambiguity, right? What you get is a variety of models that can be placed, let's say, along the spectrum that goes from community forest to non-community forest. And where a community, where it becomes non-community is kind of subjective. And that's something that we're actually struggling with our study here in the US in terms of how we define community and which of these dimensions are we using to define community. But I'll let Susan get into that a little later, and we actually want to have a discussion about that with you all later. But just to note that ambiguity that's happening here is a global thing, right? There are some very clear-cut cases that are called community forests because they have, 4 of these dimensions, right? They have ownership or management and definitely benefits and access. And so, but then there are others that are much less clear because maybe the answer is community to only a couple of them, a couple of these dimensions. So however you define it, we know that community forestry is definitely on the rise internationally. At this point, we're at the point where 14% of the world's forests are either owned or reserved for management by communities or indigenous peoples. But still, most of the world's forests are owned by national governments, right? But that share of community-owned or managed forests has been increasing quite a bit, particularly since the 1990s. So that's at the global scale, but let's split that up a little to look at the difference between so-called developed countries and low and middle income countries. And here you see a huge disparity. In developed countries, communities, and here you're looking at the blue and the green colors, we're at about 3% of forests are community owned. In low and middle income countries, we're up to 28%. So if you break that down even further, focusing here on low and middle income countries, and you just look at it regionally, again, you see some big disparities. In Latin America and Asia, it's over 30%. In Africa, it's less than 10%. In Latin America, the bulk of this has happened since the 1990s. 215 million hectares have been transferred to communities since then in Latin America. In Asia, you do have a very high percentage, but what the community can do with that forest is quite limited when you compare it to Latin America. There are just a lot more restrictions on the forest there. In Africa, we just haven't seen that wave of community ownership, and federal governments or central governments still own the majority of forests there. And if you break it down in Latin America even a little more, it's amazing how large a percentage of some of these forests are being managed by communities. In Mexico, it's 60 to 80% of community-owned forests. In other Amazonian countries, other Latin American countries, especially in the Amazon, it is still a very large chunk. And if you look at the Americas in general, the US is actually quite an outlier in how little of the forests are community owned or managed. So what are they managing for, all these community forests? So for the rest of the presentation, I'm really focusing here on community forests in low and middle income countries. So they're managing for all sorts of products, timber products, non-timber products, forest services, both for subsistence and commercialization purposes. So we get kind of fixated on timber and firewood, but it definitely isn't just about timber. You have, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you have, forest fruits and forest foods. This is acai, which is a very becoming more and more popular berry in Western markets, but it's also considered a staple food in the Amazon. You have pine resin, you have honey making and beekeeping. These are in Mexico. The honey making is selling honey to tourist areas in Quintana Roo. You have ecotourism projects developing all over the place. You even have people sort of commodifying and commercializing water. So this is a community-owned water bottling business in Mexico as well. So it's quite variable in terms of the products and services that community forests are providing. And if you think about in terms of scale, these things can be incredibly small scale, where it's just a person with a chainsaw and a few buddies who go and log a tree every now and then. It takes them a day to log maybe one tree or two trees because they're sort of manually skidding these logs through the tropical mud to the nearest river to ship the log upriver. Or you have people who are, cutting smaller pieces of wood, putting them on bicycles or being pulled by oxen to take out to then make a piece of furniture with that log. So it can be very, very small scale. Get a little bit more mechanized, and these are pictures from Cameroon. Sorry, the previous pictures were in the Brazilian Amazon. These are pictures from Cameroon where you have portable sawmills. People are creating boards in the forest and then sort of head loading them out to the markets. You can imagine that these types of operations employ a lot of people because they're so reliant on manual labor. And then you can have highly mechanized and vertically integrated community forest enterprises. And these are pictures from Mexico where you have community-owned sawmills, furniture making factories, again, community owned. So in Oaxaca, you have plantations and nurseries. You have industrial pine resin making facilities. And again, back to that water bottling plant, which is again, community owned. So there's a huge variety in terms of products, but also scale of operations and degree of mechanization. But all in all, they do tend to provide multiple benefits. And again, we sort of focus in and zero in on like employment and income and profits. Community forests all over the place do tend to have sort of limited financial profits. So they're not incredibly profitable enterprises. As you can imagine, these are smaller scale enterprises, so they have difficulties reaching economies of scale and such. But some of them do generate profits that then are either divided as dividends to the community or invested in community projects or reinvested into the enterprises themselves. But for the most part, economically speaking, community forests are much more about the employment that they provide than the profits that they're making. So they provide a lot of local employment, and in a lot of places a very important benefit because they're trying to sort of stem out migration. They don't want people leaving these rural areas, and providing that extra employment helps retain youth, but in particular in these communities. But the idea of community forestry is that, giving communities access to forests not only helps them benefit from forest-related businesses, but can empower them to have control over other benefits that come from forests, subsistence benefits, health benefits, cultural and spiritual benefits, and they're really contributing to a broader sense of prosperity and well-being. So why is a shift to community forests happening, and why does it continue to grow? I'm going to briefly talk about 4 reasons why we're seeing more community forests in lower income, middle income countries, mostly tropical countries. But these reasons are they definitely come out of the international context, but as I go through them, you'll see that there are a lot of parallels or similar reasons, and some of these might resonate with the US context as well. So the first one I'll talk about is this idea that central control of forests can be inefficient. So centralized, federal government or national government control of forests can be inefficient. Lots of countries and international funders sort of came to the realization that centralized control was just failing in many places. You have these, large swaths of forest like the Amazon that are impossible to monitor and manage from a central office in, far away in Brasilia. Bureaucracies can't afford to keep tabs on all parts of the forest. So several governments have been decentralizing as a way to sort of put more of that responsibility on local groups. This was also heavily pushed by the international community in the 80s and 90s with structural adjustment programs and neoliberalization pushes that are really trying to overcome the inefficiencies of central government control in general. And organizations like the World Bank made funding contingent on decentralization in the forest sector. For example, Cameroon was set to receive a very large loan from the World Bank to reform its forest sector, but it was contingent on if Cameroon would create new community forests and have a community forest policy. So some of this push has been because of sort of international community and international donors pushing for increased community forests. You can kind of think of a parallel situation happening here, right, where the Forest Service is realizing that with its ever shrinking resources for forest management, they're pushing more and more to work with local partners and local collaborators so that they can fill in that shortfall in the Forest Service's reach. So another big reason is that since the 1980s, countries have been increasingly recognizing traditional rights to lands. And a lot of that land is forest lands, rights of indigenous groups and local communities. As I said a few slides ago, much of this has been happening in Latin America. 215 million hectares have been transferred to indigenous peoples and local communities in the last couple of decades. In Latin America, a lot of countries' constitutions have been rewritten to recognize customary rights to lands. There have been really large-scale efforts happening to demarcate and map indigenous territories. And of course, this has followed years of social movement since the 60s and 70s from the bottom up, pushing for this action that have been recognized by, again, international bodies like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, declarations essentially on indigenous self-determination that have put pressure on countries to give back a lot of forests to indigenous and local groups. And as a result, we have an increased amount of forests back in the hands of indigenous and local groups. Again, you can sort of think of parallels here in the US with tribes more and more asserting traditional rights on federal lands, reacquiring lands, and building partnerships across different ownerships. So the third big reason why we're seeing more and more community forestry is part of a broader push for community-based natural resource management in general. Right, so studies have been piling up showing empirically that local natural resource managers can, in some situations, do a better job at conserving a resource. For a number of reasons. They have a vested interest in that resource. They are better able to monitor and enforce rules just because they're there. They have particular local knowledge that is useful in managing ecosystems. They're more likely to pick up on changes in the ecosystem, et cetera. And, again, here in the US, we are seeing more and more communities buying up forests to prevent those forests from being developed or over harvested, or buying lands for, through conservation easements or carbon credits. Because internationally, there's a global push also to recognize that local land rights are a good way to keep forests that we have, keep them still intact. So for example, a lot of studies are coming out showing that when you title indigenous lands, this is a study on the top in the Peruvian Amazon, when you title indigenous lands, that ends up protecting the forest from deforestation quite a bit more than untitled lands or other types of ownerships. Another study in the middle here, same thing. It looked at comparing indigenous lands versus protected areas as in terms of deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon, and found that, again, indigenous lands were doing a better job at preventing deforestation than even protected areas. And similarly, in the study in the bottom, they found similar results in the Mayan forest in Mexico and Guatemala. Now there's also a big push in the climate movement to recognize indigenous rights to lands for that reason. You know, indigenous peoples have customary rights to over 30% of the intact forests we have left. And so the climate movement is jumping on this and saying, you need to give them stronger rights over this land if we want to avoid the emissions that are going to happen from deforestation. So now it's really entered the climate conversation as well. And then just another example here, this was a recent study that was done in Nepal. You know, Nepal has one of the oldest and most widespread community forest programs. They have over 18,000 community forests throughout the country. And this study found that community forests are doing a better job at reducing deforestation and poverty when compared to similar areas outside of community forests. So more and more studies happening at sort of a large scale with more robust analyses showing that these types of forests, these local ownerships, this recognition of rights seems to be a good way to conserve forests. This study in particular leads us to that fourth reason, the fourth and last reason I'll talk about today, community forests being promoted as a poverty alleviation tool or a way to sustainably develop rural areas. Again, here in the US, we know that a lot of forest dependent communities have been devastated in recent years. So it's worth considering whether putting forests back into the hands of local people can help somehow transform local economies or provide additional benefits for rural development. On the international stage, in terms of poverty alleviation globally, community forestry does have a strong record in some places, showing that the potential is there to help with poverty alleviation. This is another recent report that was just released a couple of weeks ago that looked at the forest and poverty relationship globally. And as a lead author on one of the chapters that looked at different levers or different policies and programs that have been used in the forest sector to alleviate poverty. And we found that community forestry was one of the very few forest sector policies or interventions that had some pretty strong evidence for poverty reduction. Again, this isn't happening everywhere that community forests are occurring, but the evidence that does exist in some places is showing us that there is a lot of potential there. The community forests can be used as a tool for poverty alleviation and rural development. And so because of all these reasons, there has been this really large international mobilization for pushing community forestry as a sort of a win-win-win situation, right? A poverty alleviation and conservation combo. So you have, giant NGOs like WWF, and you have the UN and US Agency on International Development and the UK counterpart, and all these different groups internationally funding programs to promote community forestry, to strengthen customary rights, to sort of reform policies so that communities can be managing their forests and benefiting from them. But what we're finding, as I say, there's a lot of potential there, but it seems to be that a lot of studies are showing that community forests are delivering more on the conservation goals than on the livelihood goals. These programs have been more geared towards conserving forests and a little less geared towards tackling poverty or rural development. But it's kind of a mixed bag. Is it working? Is it not? Is it better for forest conservation? Is it not? You see examples, different kinds of examples around the world of either outcome. So the last thing I wanted to present to you was a global study that we did to kind of help us see some of these global trends. We know there are lots of case studies with mixed results, positive this, negative that, but can we say anything more globally? How's community forestry doing at a more global scale? What do we know about how well we're achieving these goals, these 3 goals that you see here? Securing rights of local people, conserving forests, and improving livelihoods. So we did this systematic review of the literature. So all the literature that we could find on community forestry, peer-reviewed literature that we could find on community forestry, and did a sort of a meta-analysis of all their results to see how community forestry was doing globally. There's a little map of where the studies were distributed. Again, this is focused on that, mostly on that tropical belt, but is really all low and middle income countries. We had a lot of cases from India, Nepal, Brazil, Mexico, Tanzania, but a fair representation from, I think, 51 countries of where the cases came from, for a total of over 600 cases that we analyzed. And so how did all these cases do in terms of these 3 things? Well, we saw environmental improvements in over 50% of the cases. So this is improvements in forest cover or forest condition or forest health. We saw income improvements in over 65% or 68% of the cases. And these were community level income. So any income that's been sort of invested in community development projects, or household level incomes. But we saw access and use rights improvements in only 34% of the cases. Access and use rights actually decreased in over 50% of the cases globally. That seems a little odd, considering that, rights, increasing security of rights is like one of the central tenets and mechanisms of community forests, right? So we found that, there were a lot of trade-offs in outcomes where rights were being compromised. And you can sort of think of different mechanisms here where it is a direct trade-off where, okay, to conserve the forest, you're reducing people's access rights to that forest. So that's part of it. But so that act of formalizing these previously customary rights often meant that forest users were being left with fewer rights, less access to the forest. But in other cases, it was more that different people in the community were being affected differently. So some users were being left out of the community that is meant to benefit from that formalization of the rights. So they weren't the ones who were getting those increased incomes from the formalization of community forestry. So this is, again, pretty striking result that local rights for access and use of resources are often compromised with community forest arrangements, which is countering one of the central tenets of, or the central goals of why we're promoting CFM, right? But on the flip side, we also found that when rights weren't compromised, so all those cases where we did see rights improving or not being lost, that forest condition and income were mostly maintained or enhanced. Right. So this suggests that even if your main concern is development or conservation, that third rights-based element can be an important predictor of positive outcomes for those goals. So one slide to just wrap it all up. There are many models of community forestry globally. It is incredibly difficult to define it clearly, but we do have a sense for what is common to most of them. It has been increasing in popularity. It continues to be promoted in different places because it's seen as this win-win-win situation: empowerment, conservation, poverty alleviation. We see lots of examples in the world, around the world. We see a lot of great success stories, but we also see a lot of places where it's just not achieving what it's meant to achieve, where communities are still struggling to find markets, to sustainably manage, to deal with some of these loss of rights and balance them with alternative livelihoods. So we are missing the mark on empowering communities in a lot of places. And despite all this potential and all these examples of success, the international community really does see this a potential that has not been realized in most countries. So we still have a lot to do in terms of figuring out how to best make them work for people in forests globally. So I will leave it at that.
so much. You are right on time.
Oh, good.
Impressive.
That's great.
And I think folks are starting to enter some questions into the chat, but I would like to just remind folks to do that. We will keep them in our notes and we'll save them all sort of for a question and answer at the end with both of our presenters. Thank you so much, Dr. Hajjar. And Dr. Charnley, do you want to get your slides up and going? And I can, while you're working on that, I will introduce you.
Great.
Just a reminder to everyone, you are at the first virtual Community Forest Forum. We're so excited to have you all here. And our presenters today are both from Oregon State University, talking to us about perspectives on community forestry in the United States and globally. Dr. Charnley is our second presenter. She's an environmental anthropologist whose research aims to improve understanding of how to integrate community well-being and development with ecosystem health and the sustainable management of natural resources with the goal of informing policy and advancing theory. Susan received her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University and is based out of the United States Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. Her recent publications include writings on community forestry based on federal lands, fostering collective action to reduce wildfire risk, and ranchers, beavers, and stream restoration. Quite a diversity of topics. It looks like your slides are up, Susan, and I think, do you want to make sure we can hear you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Great. Well, that was a wonderful overview of community forestry globally by Reem. And now what we want to do is focus in more on community forestry near rather than far. And so I'm going to turn now to talk about some research that Reem and I are collaborating in with other researchers from the Forest Service and the Southern Research Station and International Institute of Tropical Forestry, as well as at North Carolina State University. We're doing a study of community forestry nationally in the United States, but Reem and I are leading the charge on community forestry in the 11 Western states. So we're going to focus on what we've learned to date from this project about community forestry in the West. And let me say that the findings we present are preliminary findings from the work we've done so far. We're going to be continuing this research over the next couple of years. So this is just the beginning, but we want to share what we've learned to date. Let's see, as Reem said, trying to see if I can advance my slide. Oh, sure. Yep. I want to acknowledge Kaylee Kornhauser, who's a graduate student working with me at Oregon State University. She has been helping us with this project to date with data gathering and data management and analysis. So thank you to Kaylee. We also want to thank the Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station for funding that we've gotten to support the project to date. Okay, well, as Reem mentioned, she just did a meta-analysis of 600 cases of community forestry plus from 51 countries around the world. Since the 1990s, there's been a great rise in community forestry globally. And there's been consequently over the last 10 or 15 years, a large amount of research that's been undertaken about community forestry globally. But if we look at the United States, we find that really there's only a handful of studies to date that have been done on community forestry here. There's a fair amount of research on forestry on private family forest lands. There's a fair amount of research on forestry on federal lands, but very little research on community forestry in the US. So our goal then with our project is, first of all, to characterize the nature of community forestry in the United States. We also want to understand the factors and the conditions that allow community forests in the US to achieve some of those goals that it's trying to achieve globally, namely to help conserve forest lands and promote their sustainable management, and also to contribute to rural prosperity and well-being. Okay, and then we want to share this information so that we can help to inform community forestry related policies and programs as they develop here in the United States. So with those goals in mind, we have to start back with what is going to be our definition of community forest and what are our criteria for including community forest in our study or not. Again, a topic that we've all been wrestling with. So for purposes of this study, we began by including community forests in the US that self-identify as a community forest. They call themselves a community forest. Now, it may or may not be that those community forests that call themselves such meet our other definitions of community forestry, but for now, we're including them in our study. And so similarly with what Reem said globally, we are looking at community forests where the local community has rights of access and use, which is critical, of course. And then in addition, some degree of management engagement or management responsibility for that forest, as well as some degree of involvement in decision-making around what happens on that forest. But we need to recognize that given that the community itself has a variety of definitions, and I think we may be hearing about that later on in the forum, but it's just important to bear in mind that a community could mean a tribe. A community could mean a group of people who collectively own a piece of private land. A community can also be, you know, a local community where that forest is located. It could also be a community-based organization. So there's various ways of trying to understand what we mean by community in the case of community forestry in the US. And then in addition, one of our defining characteristics is that the community forest is managed to ultimately promote ecological sustainability, as well as create benefits for that local community where the forest is located. So this for now is our working definition, but we will see how it evolves through the course of our research. Okay, well, we're undertaking research in a two-phased approach to try and address our project goals. The first phase is to characterize, again, the nature of community forestry in the United States. And in order to do that, we're doing an inventory of all the community forests that are out there across the country. And we want to characterize them in terms of basic features, and then we want to try and classify them to see if we can come up with a topology of community forests in the US that will help us understand these different types that are out there. So that's the part that we have started in on to date. The second phase of our research project will be to better understand those factors, again, that do help community forests create conservation benefits, as well as benefits for local communities. And to do that, we need to definitely take a deeper dive into case studies of community forests. So we will be choosing a selection of case studies of community forests from around the country and studying them more in depth to understand how they function to create these conservation as well as community benefits. In addition, we're going to undertake a review of federal and state policies and programs that pertain to community forests to see how they are helping those community forests achieve their goals. What I'm going to talk about today is the preliminary results of our inventory of community forests from the Western United States. So moving forward then, the data I'm going to be talking about come from this first phase of research. Okay, so how did we undertake this effort to characterize community forests nationally? Well, we undertook a survey, and some of you may be aware of this survey because you've responded to it. And if you did, thank you so much for doing that. The survey is directed towards people who are affiliated with community forests that we've identified and included in our sample. And it basically asks for some fundamental characteristics of community forests that I'll be sharing the results about here soon, about their management goals, about who's involved in decision-making, who's involved in day-to-day operations, what kind of community access and use exists in these forests, and how are they contributing to jobs and income creation in local communities, as well as, you know, some other questions, but this is basically what we're covering here. Again, the survey is being implemented nationally by our colleagues as well, and we'll combine the results of this survey with what we learned from the Eastern states' effort to implement the same survey among community forests in the East. As far as the Western community forests, we started with an initial list of 63 that we acquired from various sources, but we only sent surveys to 47 of these 63 because we determined that 16 of them weren't really community forests according to our criteria for inclusion. We had 29 people complete our survey for a 62% response rate. And then we were able to fill in characteristics for community forests for another 6 community forests based on information we gathered from the web. And so our total sample size for now is 35 community forests. Of those, 5 of them are still in the process of being formed and they haven't quite completed their establishment yet, but we included information about them anyway. So although this is our sample size to date, that sample may grow as we learn about additional community forests. or perhaps other people respond to our survey. And I do want to say that there are some limitations with our sample. In particular, I think we've underrepresented community forests that occur on public lands as well as tribal lands. And that's mostly because we're really struggling to figure out, well, you know, how do we define what a community forest is in the context of federal lands, for example? So that's, again, something that we'll come back to towards the end of our presentation today. Okay, well, where are these community forests? You can see here where they are by state. There are 6 different states where we identified community forests in our sample. Almost two-thirds of these are in Oregon and Washington. And if you look at their distribution nationwide, or sorry, in the West, you can see here we've highlighted the counties where they occur. We don't have coordinates for exactly where all of them are yet. So we've just highlighted by county where these community forests from our survey are located, and the colors indicate how many community forests are in those counties where they do occur. What we will be in, okay, so the community forest, when were they established? Well, as Reem talked about, you know, we saw a big rise in community forestry globally starting in the 1990s. I would say here in the United States, though, the big rise happened really in the last 10 years. About half of the community forests in our sample were established over the last 10 years. The mean is the year 2007. And that bar to the right where you see 5 between 2020 and 2030, those are the ones that haven't yet been established. Okay, what kind of lands do these community forests occur on? Well, again, you can see some of the limitations of our survey here. We only identified one on federal government lands. That's the Weaverville Community Forest in California. Again, we're trying to figure out what is a community forest in the federal lands context. We identified 2 that occur on state lands. Those are both in Washington state, and we understand by talking with our colleagues from the East that actually those are the only 2 community forests nationwide that we're aware of to date that occur on state lands. A lot of them occur on local government lands. Those could be city lands, those could be county lands. We have 1 that occurs on tribal lands. We don't have any on family forest lands, 2 on private corporate lands, and some of those are in transition. One of them is in transition to a local government. The other, I believe, has a conservation easement. But then other private, that's the category mostly of nonprofit organizations. Those could be land trusts, those could be community-based organizations, and then some are in joint ownership. But again, the vast majority, I would say, are either local government owned or owned by other private organizations. Who were the former owners of these community forests? Well, although the current community forests are predominantly on local government or other private lands, by and large, they were not formally owned by these entities. The vast majority were previously owned by private corporate lands. And I think that makes sense given the fact that about 2/3 of our community forests in our sample are in Oregon and Washington. And we know that in Oregon and Washington over the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of land or forest land ownership turnover among, timber companies. We have REITs, we have TMOs, and a lot of those lands have been changing hands, and community forests in these 2 states in part have been formed as a way of acquiring some of those lands during the transition process to ensure that they continue on as working forests in local communities and to try and ensure their conservation. So a lot of these, again, were from private corporate ownerships previously. If we take a step back and look at forest ownership in the United States, we see that it's really different east and west. In the West, a lot of the forest lands occur on federal lands. The orange, that's the dark green that you're seeing on the map. The orange is the corporate lands. The blue is the state lands. If you compare to the east, you see a lot of light green, which is family forest lands. So we're expecting that when we combine our results with those from the east, we may see some differences in land ownership patterns of community forests east and west. Although again, what we would expect in the West is you'd see more community forests in the context of public lands, particularly federal, possibly state, and we're still trying to sort that out. So how big are these community forests? Well, of the 35 forests in our survey, the total acreage that we found was 281,823 acres here in the West. The average size was just over 8,000 acres. The smallest community forest was 80 acres on local government lands. The largest was 70,000 on lands held by a private nonprofit organization. If you look at average size by ownership, again, this is a little bit skewed for those that have a small sample size. We only have 2 state forests. One is only actually a couple thousand acres. The other is almost 50,000 acres. We have only 1 on federal lands. That's almost 15,000 acres. But we do have a reasonable sample size for those community forests that are held by nonprofit organizations and other private organizations. So that's just over 13,000. The local government community forests tend to be much smaller, around 1,500, which one might expect. And then the one tribal land ownership in our sample is about 310 acres, although there's a second community forest owned by a tribe, the Yurok, and that's going to be, once it's handed over to them fully, it'll be close to 50,000 acres. So again, the small sample sizes don't give us a great guidance, but it is interesting to look at these numbers anyway. Okay, what are the primary management goals of these community forests? Well, on our survey, we asked respondents to identify the top 4 management goals. And so the top 4 management goals that were most commonly identified by respondents, first was recreation. Second was timber production, which was on a primary goal in almost half of our community forests. And then forest restoration, including wildfire management, was a primary management goal on almost half of the community forests. And then it was kind of a tie between water resources, water resource protection and restoration, as well as restoration or protection of fish and wildlife habitat. So these were the most commonly mentioned management goals. The least commonly mentioned were carbon sequestration, grazing, cultural heritage, and those were actually only identified by the respondents from tribal lands. And then non-timber forest products gathering was not a primary goal on most of these forests. Okay, timber production. It occurs on 79% of the community forests in our survey, or 26 out of 33. The other 3 we don't have information for. And how does that break down by land ownership? Well, we find that all of them, the lands in the categories that aren't circled at the moment, have timber production on them. And then if you look at the community forests on local government lands, it's about 71%. Those on other private lands, it's about 88%. And then those under joint ownership, it's about 43%. So timber production is pretty common, but it doesn't occur everywhere. What else is allowed in these community forests? Well, we asked all of our respondents to identify activities that are allowed on their community forests. And we found that the most commonly allowed was non-motorized recreation. And we found that commonly prohibited activities are camping, motorized recreation off of the main access roads through those forests, harvesting firewood and other non-timber forest products, both for personal and commercial use, was often prohibited, although commercial harvesting was more commonly prohibited than personal use harvesting. And then we found that in all but 2 cases, the general public has the same access and use rights as community members. The 2 cases where that was an exception was on one tribally managed community forest, and the other, I believe, was on a private corporate forest land that was in transition. But otherwise, yeah, there's not a big distinction between what the local community or community, however it's defined, can do on those community forests and what the general public can do. Income generation. We're interested in income generation because that's a big question for community forests, not just in the United States, but globally, as Reem referred to. Does the community forest generate income both for the land owning as well as the managing entity? Those can sometimes be different to help contribute to their ability to manage and operate the community forest. But does the community forest also generate income for community members as one way of creating local community benefit? And we found that in the majority of cases, yes, the community forest does generate income for these different entities. We found that of that income, that main income came primarily from timber, but in some cases it came from payments for ecosystem services, and more specifically, the sale of carbon offset credits. In 2 cases, there was income from grazing permits. And in one case, there was income from recreation fees. Specifically, there was a hunting lease on the community forest. Otherwise, we did not see income being generated from recreation fees on these community forests. We also wanted to know if the community forest generates income for these different landowners, again, to help contribute to their operating budgets. And so this, you have to kind of read across the rows. This is just the former slide broken down by ownership for two of these, both the owner as well as the community, again, as a way of creating local community benefit. And it does create income for both the owner and the community in most of the cases, but not in all of the cases, to some degree on the local government lands, and to some degree on the private nonprofit operated lands, but it's kind of mixed there. Okay, well, we also asked community forests what the main sources of support for their operating budget has been over the last 3 years. And we named a variety of different sources, and we asked them whether those sources contributed nothing to their annual operating budgets, whether they contributed between 1 and 30%, from 30 to 60%, or over 60% of their budgets, to get a sense of, how these community forests are being supported. And I'm not going to go into that great level of detail here, but I will say in terms of what are the income sources that community forests are at least getting some money from for their operating budgets, just over half are getting money from federal or state government grants. Just under half are getting income again from the community forest operations itself. For example, the kinds of sources we just talked about in the previous slide. Just under half are getting money from the local government budgets, and then almost 43% get money from grants or donations from nonprofit organizations. Around 38% get donations from community members themselves, and just over 28% get money from holding fundraising events. Okay, decision-making authority is, again, one of our key criteria for identifying, what counts as a community forest. And so I'll just walk you through this a little bit. I'm sorry that my cursor doesn't work very well for pointing to the results here, but if we look across the rows here, we find that who has decision-making authority on community forests on federal and state lands? Well, that's the federal government or the state government that is the owner of those lands. And I think that makes sense. Certainly other entities that are listed here have input into decision-making, but the government seems to have ultimate decision-making authority. So that's back to our question about, are these really community forests? I mean, I do think there are a lot of cases in which there's joint decision-making. But the respondents in this case didn't identify that because, again, the question was around who has authority to make those decisions. In the case of local governments, though, we see more often the response was it can be, just the government, or it can be the local government, which one could consider often represents local community members. There can also be joint decision-making on those local government community forests. That could be in the form of, say, an advisory committee of citizens that's set up to advise the government agency or entity that might be managing those lands. So I think there's, probably more that kind of engagement there. On tribal lands, there was joint decision-making for the one that we had in our sample. On private corporate lands, these results look a little surprising here, where we see government agency having decision-making authority on those private corporate lands. That's a case in which those corporate lands are in transition to a local government. And so the local government entity is making the decisions at this point. And where you see joint decision-making, I believe that's the case where we have a conservation easement on those corporate lands. And then lands that are held by these other private entities. The local nonprofit organization is often the decision maker there, but again, one could consider that being a community-based organization that has community representation and input. So that, I think, helps to explain why you can see community influence there. And then in these community forests that have joint ownership, you see a variety of decision-making combinations. If we look at who contributes to day-to-day management, again, we can just begin by talking across the rows here. We see on that one federal lands case, the government agency contributes to management, but so do local individuals and groups. On the two state forests, we see a number of entities being involved in day-to-day management operations. And the same is true in the case of local government lands. A lot of different groups contribute to their day-to-day management operations. And that can mean, going out and helping with activities on the forests as volunteer groups, or more formally, say if you're hired as a forestry consultant. So a variety of different people involved there. On the one tribal lands, it was mainly tribal members that were contributing to day-to-day management. On the private corporate land, again, it was that local government where we saw that land ownership in transition. And then on these other privately held community forests, again, we have a number of organizations contributing to management there, and the same is true on those jointly held forest lands. If we look down the columns, we can see that government agencies at all different scales, that non-governmental organizations or nonprofits, as well as local and individuals and groups are contributing to day-to-day management operations across a variety of community forest types. Okay, well, this brings us to our typology of community forests. And again, we think it could be useful to develop a typology to help us think about and characterize the nature of different forms and models of community forestry that we have here in the United States. We'll eventually be developing this typology as we combine our survey results with those survey results that are acquired by our Eastern colleagues. They've also inventoried about 40 different community forests in the East to date. We haven't combined our results yet, so we haven't started talking about what a typology would be, but we do think that land ownership is one of the key features in identifying a typology. And then beyond land ownership, are there certain features that might be associated with some types of community forests under some ownerships versus others? We're not sure yet. We've looked at forest management goals. We've looked at timber production. That doesn't seem to be associated with the one particular kind of ownership. So probably where we'll focus is the degree of engagement in both management operations and in decision-making that occurs on these different land ownerships as we develop our typology. But again, that's a work in progress. So that's the end of my presentation of results. What we'd love to do now is turn it over to you, because we'd like to have a discussion in our last half hour here on a couple of topics that we're struggling with, and we think that you, as most of you are engaged in community forest efforts, forestry efforts on the ground, you could perhaps help us to sort out. And so maybe I'll just list here the 4 things that we'd love your input on and that we'd love to have some discussion about today. And then maybe we can just kind of go through them sequentially. And again, this is this critical question of how do we understand community forestry in the context of publicly owned forest lands? On federal lands, on national forest lands, could we have a community forest under a stewardship agreement operation? Should we look at all stewardship agreements and stewardship contracts, for example, and consider those short-term community forests if there's quite a bit of community engagement in management and decision-making on what happens on those lands? I don't know, what about county city lands? Is it just the city government managing it with not much community involvement, and is that good enough? What's the difference between, say, just a normal city park? Like I live in Portland, so we have Forest Park. It's a park that residents of Portland have access to, many people go to and enjoy. It's managed by the city. So is that a community forest or not? And how is that different from some of the other city-owned community forest lands? Where do we draw the line? We could have a huge long list if we include every county and city park that has forest on it, in the Western US. So what's a community forest and what's not in these different public lands contexts? We'd love to talk with you about that. We'd also, as I mentioned, phase 2 of this project, we'll be doing more in-depth case studies, and we're looking for places to go to do those case studies. We'd like to do those across a range of land ownership types. So if anybody is familiar with a community forest that they think would make a great case study to investigate more in depth in terms of contributions to conservation and community livelihoods, we'd love to know about it. If you'd be willing to have researchers come and study more what's going on there. we want to know what would be useful information for you to have from this research and how would you like to receive it. And then we also need some more input on our list of community forests. We'd love to know whether there are community forests that are on our list that you don't think should be, or vice versa. If there are ones you're aware of that we're not, that we could identify and add to our list and send a survey to. And we are going to put up a document in the Google chat box in a bit here that you can either download and email back to us, or that you can edit right online in Google Docs and give us information about. So those are the things we're looking for information about. And that's it for me. So why don't we open it up then? I guess I'll hand it back over to you, Ben or Cal. Now, should I stop sharing my screen or should I just keep this up here?
I think if you want to leave it up, that's fine. Although if we do want to invite people to turn on their videos so we can have more of a discussion at this point, that would be great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Susan. That's so much information between you and Reem. It's a lot to think about.
To digest.
And we've had some good questions coming through. Yeah, that's great. I think one housekeeping question we had was just about your report. And I think folks were wondering if you have these results already summarized in a report. Is that forthcoming? I don't think that's been published yet.
No, these are preliminary results. So we want to work with them more. We want to try and add to our results by, making sure that we've covered all the community forests that are out there, which is partly why we're asking for you to fill in blanks that we may have. So we haven't summarized them yet, but we will be.
Great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have been keeping notes on the questions, and as has Ben, and I know Reem, you've been answering some of them in the chat, but I think it might be helpful to go through them again just so everyone hears the answers, both the question and the answer. And we do have some time here. Do we want to start with maybe an unanswered question for Susan, which is coming from Jacqueline Danos? Is there an overlap with community forests and a restoration economy? And Reem, you're welcome to answer as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is. That's something that we'll be looking more into when we get to this next phase of our research with the case studies. But I think, as we mentioned, I think, what was it, 79% or something of the community forests have timber production that goes on. But also one of the key management goals for these forests is restoration. And so because many of these community forests have restoration as a management goal, I think there's definite overlap with the restoration economy there. And certainly that's one of the things we'll be examining as we look more in depth at individual cases. Reem, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's also going to depend on how we define community forest. And I think a lot of these stewardship groups that are involved in restoration activities haven't been included in our sample, but it's an open question of whether or not they should be. And just to note, so I've been answering questions in the chat, so just to try to leave a little bit more time for discussion as well. But I'm also happy to answer questions about the global stuff.
I think there was, yeah, do you want to summarize some of those questions, Reem, and just make sure that everyone gets to hear them?
Sure. So Rebecca was asking about just some more examples of where we've sort of failed on the securing rights aspect of community forestry. And I wrote back thinking, I can think of examples in Nepal and Kenya and Cameroon where, formalizing rights. So these, these communities have had customary rights to these resources, but then when you formalize it or legalize it or bring in a community forest project, that has sort of limited what they had been previously doing or what they previously had rights to. So for example, a lot of people can't collect fodder for their livestock, or they can't graze their animals in there. That's one that we've seen in a lot of different cases, or it limits their ability to use some products. But also what we're seeing a lot is that there's in lots of cases where you have like sort of systematic marginalization of different groups, so lower castes or different ethnic groups within the community. So they end up not being included as rights holders to the community. So while the rest of the community might be getting more benefits and incomes from the new community forest activities, they've been excluded from those. And on top of that, they've lost their ability to access resources that they previously had rights to. And so we see that in a lot of cases. Gabe asked about, well, where has it been successful? What does securing rights look like? I can think of plenty of examples. I'm most familiar with examples in Mexico and Brazil, where having those rights secured, and a principal way to secure those rights is to exclude outsiders, right? So, corporations or legal loggers or whatever outside the community no longer have the ability to access that resource. And so that needs to be enforced as well. So that securing of rights has led sort of to a cascade of benefits. The base thing is that the rights need to be secured, and then they build on that to either commercialize a product or just have a more secure access to products that they use for their livelihoods, for subsistence purposes and such. And so you do see that in lots of cases. And I also added that it's super rare to see where it's been completely equitable across everybody in the community, just because of the nature that, not everybody's going to be employed. Some people are going to be employed and are going to be benefiting more. But there are cases where at least it's not getting worse for others, and everybody is able to benefit from community development projects, like using that increased income to invest in schools or wells or health clinics and such. So everybody gets something out of it, even though it's not, everybody's not getting the same out of it. And then the last question was about the Convention on Biological Diversity, but I don't know enough about the details because that's going to be particular to each country and how they interpret that intellectual property law. And I said, the cynic in me makes me think that, communities are not going to get the benefits of intellectual property from compounds in the forest, but I may be wrong there. I'm probably wrong there. There are probably some empowered groups that have been able to negotiate with their national governments on that.
Hope. I think another question just came in from Rebecca for you, Reem. Did you see access to community rights being an important component to U.S. community forests the way it has been in other countries?
I think it in a different way. So I'm thinking in the international context where you have a lot of illegal activities happening, where you have a lot of people encroaching on forests that are only protected by customary rights, that you don't really see in the US. So in those cases, internationally, the exclusion factor has been a very strong component. And it's also a factor where, a lot of these groups have been functioning in the informal sector, right? If they don't have legal rights to a piece of land, they only have customary rights. They're not recognized to be legally operating, but they've functioned well in the informal world. By legalizing those rights, they can function even better. They can market their products on different kinds of markets and such. They can get more income for those products because they're now sort of in the legal sphere. And you don't have those similar dynamics in the US. So I see it less important in that sense, but at the same time, the sort of management rights, the decision-making rights in US community forests, I see as being important if the forest is going to function to the benefit of the community. I do think that it is important for community members to be able to have the rights to participate in that decision making. If they might not need to have ownership rights, but having that participation right is going to be an important factor if you want to see the community forest actually benefiting the community more than anything else. Susan, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think you did good. I think that's about it. One thing I was struck by was, a lot of these community forests in the U.S. are being established to help maintain access and use rights by community members to forests, so that people have opportunities for recreation or for environmental education or for other activities. And so I think that's been a big driver of community forest mitigation here. Similarly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
have just a couple other questions for you, but then I know you do want to have a discussion, Susan, and I think we could, I think the questions that you're asking are really well aligned with some of the work that the Northwest Community Forest Coalition has been doing the last few months, as I think you're aware, with, you know, how and where do we define a community forest and where do we draw those lines. So I definitely want to leave another 10 minutes for that if we can, but just another quick question from Stephen Kelly was, if the income generation included the indirect activities, tourism or hunting and fishing, which I think you touched on, but.
Sorry, Susan, do you want to?
Oh, go ahead.
For our survey, no, it was really difficult to think of ways to capture that with an online survey, but that is a topic we want to tackle with the case studies, where we have a chance to sort of dig into those ripple effects of the community forest on the rest of the community. Yeah.
And I should mention that our colleagues on the East Coast that are joining us in this study are mostly economists. And so we will be looking at a kind of a rigorous economic analysis as we move forward with the case study.
Great. From Sarah Spaeth, are there some examples of arrangements or license agreements with local entrepreneurs and businesses who want local timber or non-timber resources for value-added production?
Yeah, so that's not something we could get at with our survey either. You know, our survey just asks kind of these, you know, more basic characteristic kind of questions. I'm sure that's something that will emerge from the case studies, and perhaps other people in the audience can answer that question who are more familiar with those individual cases, unless you are, Reem. Yeah.
Not in the US, but I can tell you on the international scene, yes, that there are lots of arrangements like that. Again, I can think of examples in Brazil where you have like a very large cosmetics company partnering with several communities in the Amazon for particular fruit productions of fruits. And they, you know, those types of community company partnerships are variable in terms of how much the community benefits and versus the company taking all the benefits. But in some more successful cases, yes, you see that these companies also help invest in the communities, and they, you know, the communities provide them with the raw material, but in some cases, the companies are helping them with some preliminary processing at least. So it does produce a lot more sort of employment in the communities. And I can also think of examples of timber companies that are sort of grouping together different community forests and again taking the raw materials from the community and helping them with their management plans or any sort of expenses that occur with timber production, and then that company is sort of able to achieve that the economies of scale that the communities themselves aren't able to achieve.
Well, thank you both so much. Do you want to try to have a conversation with our participants now about your survey, and or not the official survey, but this the input needed questions you had, or yeah,
if people would like to respond, that would be great. Yeah, maybe we could just start with the first question about how to help us think about community forestry in the context of you know, these federal lands, these county and city lands in particular, where, you know, is it just any city forest, or, you know, what's the difference between that and a community forest on city lands, for example? I should also add that we, you know, we're not just struggling with this in the context of public lands, but also tribal lands, you know, in the tribal lands context. Would it just be lands that a tribe acquires kind of fee simple, you know, to manage as a community forest? Does it include reservation lands and how those lands are managed? I mean, it's just hard to know.
If folks in the audience have thoughts, you can, I think you can unmute yourselves, but if you can't, please just let us know in the chat and we can help you to do that. Or if folks are feeling shy, we can also wait for the Google Doc. We are getting some more content-oriented questions if we want to jump back in that direction. But I know sometimes online it takes a minute to unmute and be able to participate. So I just want to see if folks have thoughts on the context of publicly owned forest lands community forest management. Sarah.
Yeah, I know this is a topic that we kind of struggled with in Washington State and out here in Jefferson County with regard to some DNR lands and whether we could kind of implement a more community forest management on some of those lands. And I know that the state was really looking at this DNR community forest model. And I think that the public participation in management decisions was potentially part of this community forest model that was being proposed, but revenue generated didn't seem to be really directly associated with coming back to the community and that local connection with community entrepreneurs, which is part of what my conversation or my question was about earlier, that you know, we really want to have the connection of the forest products with our local community, sort of as we have a local food movement, we want a local timber movement. And we didn't really see that component in this publicly owned community forest model. So to me, I think it's beyond just participation in management decisions. It's somehow further sharing of the resources that are coming out of the forest. And of course, access is a really big one as well. So that's some food for thought.
Yeah, we definitely view community benefit as one of our defining criteria that can take different forms, and obviously, you know, engagement in that, in the economic activities that occur there, and helping communities benefit from that is a big one.
We had two other comments from Nils and Jean, who are both with Wallowa Resources. Would one of you like to join the conversation over audio?
Yeah, sure. No, I'd be happy to. Reem and Susan, thank you so much. This was really fabulous way to kick this forum off. And, you know, in terms of your question there, it just, you know, it strikes me that community forests offer a you know, a new and different form of tenure and management and governance that hopefully will be more nimble and more adaptive, and also create a sort of a more direct relationship between management decisions, good and bad, with the communities that live adjacent to that, and that we can create the governance structure that would be responsive to those signals in a much more responsive and timely way than is typically seen for particularly federal and state-owned lands. And you know, I mean, I think both of you know that my history came out of working in community-based natural resource management in Southern Africa, and so I found, Reem, your introduction really fascinating, because the notion of sometimes excluding, you know, some rights can be excluded in the process of creating community tenure and governance structures, but that, at least the way I heard it and saw your slides, but that overall, you know, where community rights and access and benefits were valued and realized, that the evidence we have today, which obviously is still emerging, but it's pointing to a more likelihood of that combo of conservation and rural vitality or poverty alleviation benefit. And that's certainly what I saw in Southern Africa, although with one caveat, which was, you know, in Southern Africa, the analysis was pretty clear that the sort of trying to understand the potential significance of those benefits within the community. And often it determined, it was determined by how many people lived there. So what was the actual household revenue generated from some community management system? And when that was a significant part of the overall household income, in however, whatever measure of significance there was there, then you clearly saw this values change, behavior change, management practice change that created benefits to forest, wildlife, biodiversity conservation, health benefits, economic benefits. But that certainly in Southern Africa, where they were very successful, you either saw people moving in and beginning to erode the benefits because then it became less benefits per capita, or you saw higher levels of government essentially seizing the rents, the profit, the additional revenue, and eroding the benefit that way. And so, I mean, those were all thoughts going through my head. But to answer your question, I just think, I think this is an important experiment, and sort of really hope to see that we have more innovation in community forests, and that we've set up good systems to understand what really matters in achieving these dual desired outcomes from a community forest.
Great.
Thanks, Nels. Do you all want to move on to maybe the case study opportunities, or some of the input on what people would like to hear from the study and what format?
I think maybe for the case study opportunities, if anyone wants to volunteer their community forest, contact us. We will otherwise be contacting people as well. But maybe something that would be useful now is, even if it's just in the chat, like if a bunch of people just want to say, well, what do you want to know from the study, and what format would be most interesting to you or most useful to you? And you can just, jot down some thoughts in the chat. That would be great. In the meantime, I'm noticing that we're a little low on time. So can I share my screen to see the Google Doc?
Sure.
Yeah, let me get out of it. Let me put this one final slide. There's our email
right.
addresses
Yeah.
quickly. If anybody would prefer to just send us some comments by email, please do. And that's that. And I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen. We'll see how that goes. Okay. I think it worked.
I also recognize that it's really difficult to have these kinds of conversations in large group Zooms. And if we were there in person, I'm sure we'd get much more resolution on some of these issues. But anyway, so the link is here in the chat. So this is just a Google Doc. It lists the communities that we've already surveyed, communities that we have on our lists, but we've had either trouble getting any contact information for them, or they haven't responded to our survey requests. So those that are highlighted in yellow, we haven't heard back from anyone. So we haven't found any additional information on the web. Those that are highlighted in blue, we haven't heard back from anybody, but we found some information on the web about the community forest. But if you have any further contacts or know anybody who might be willing to take a survey, please just add their contact info in this column. The other thing we would like to ask you for is, after you go through all this list, if you know of any other community forests that haven't made it, please add them on, and any contact info again. Or if you see something in our list that you think, whoa, that's really not a community forest, let us know. There's the last column here is for additional comments. If you have anything you want to add about any of these community forests, then feel free to do so. I believe everyone has ability to just write in to the columns, or add a comment. If you see, or if you highlight something, you can add a plus sign and just write a comment here as well. I see a few people are on here already. Just
Great.
make sure that you are able to add it. I think you can add stuff directly in there.
And again, if you prefer to download this form, we've included contact information at the top where you can send it back by email or even give us a call to provide it
Right.
if you prefer that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, thank you to those of you who did fill out the survey. That's great.
Yeah. Do we have permission to contact folks at the projects listed here? Is this information for the survey only? Contact them for what? Oh, I guess there's no, oh, you mean if people
Oh,
add
yeah.
contact information?
The contact information is yes, so that we would be able to send them a survey. So firstly, if they're willing to take it and then send them the link. So that's the only way we could use it for now.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I hope you get some good responses to that. I'm really excited about the typology that you're proposing to develop. I think that's something we're all interested in. I'm sure there will be lots of conversation to be had once that's drafted out. I think we are right at our time here, unless there are some burning last questions. Oh, Rebecca, I think, is interested in having a network of community forest managers to reach out to for support, which I think the coalition tries to help provide some of that resource, but maybe that's something as you're developing, since you're reaching out to so many folks, if you're able to provide contact information or email addresses so that we can build on that network, that might be a nice output of the report. And then looks like Alex would like to know more about how decisions are made for a community forest. For example, is there a governing board making decisions on behalf of the community? And to learn more about how community forests are established in the process timeline, major milestones for that establishment.
Is that for
I do think-
the US context or?
I believe so.
Okay.
I think that might be in response to our question, what do you want to know from this study?
Oh, I see.
In what format? And so if that's something you want to know, that's great. That is certainly something that we will be looking at. Of course, it's highly variable depending on the community forest, but yeah, great.
Mm-hmm. And again, that decision-making structure was a little hard to capture in the survey. We have some like general categories of who's making the decisions, but it is something that the actual processes, the amount of community participation in that decision-making in whatever form is something we're still trying to just dig up more information on for each of the community forests.
That might also be a nice segue into our conversation later this afternoon on community engagement, which will focus some on the governance and some on sort of the outreach strategy and how to just keep communities interested in part of their community forest management. Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to present, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us this morning. We know there's Zoom fatigue, but this was such an excellent presentation and conversation. Really excited to see your work as it evolves and talk to you more.
Well, thank
Thanks for the
you.
opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Ben, for organizing us. Excellent job. The presentation will be posted online. The recording will be available once we can get it up, along with the slides, assuming that our presenters are amenable to that.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Enjoy a nice break, and we'll see you again for the next session on community engagement. A lot of the questions that have just come in would be a good conversation starter for that session as well. So look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.